Today is May 26, 2017, and we are about to enter into the seventh-day Sabbath. So before we begin, let us ask our Heavenly Family to bless us with understanding. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for loving us and for showing us the error of our own ways. In light of this message, we really are seeing more and more how we have just been so unreasonable and so unloving. But we're grateful. Thank you, Heavenly Family, for showing us a better way. Thank you for the message that has as its goal to educate us, to bring us to the point of being rid of our unreasonableness and our hatefulness. Thank you. Please give us an experience of your love tonight and help us to learn how to acquire genuine knowledge, conducting proper experiments, thinking rightly, and judging things according to the way they really are. Toda, thank you. We ask this b'shem tzemach huahi, in the name of branch, he and she. Amen.
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 Okay, so we'll be studying the community rule tonight and going about it in the usual way, dividing the study into three sections. The first section will be giving a recap of kind of what the community rule is, why it is important, and our methods of study. Second, we'll have comments and questions broadly related to the community rule. And lastly, we will continue on our line-by-line investigation of its contents. So first, the community rule is a very important text written over 2,000 years ago in the first part of the 2nd century BCE. It was written by Jews in the land of Israel, written in the Hebrew language, and it was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, from the end of the 1st century up until 1947, we know of no record of this text. In other words, it was lost to history. It was buried along with the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or I should say hid, in at least 12 caves surrounding a site called Qumran, which is on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. And it was hid there in the year 68 when the Romans were passing through and destroyed the settlement. And there it remained for nearly 2,000 years. So it's quite remarkable that we even have this text to read. Now, this was one of the first Dead Sea Scrolls that was found. And when it was found, it was pretty nearly immediately recognized to be very important. Why? Well, one thing is just that it's an unknown ancient Jewish text from before the time of Jesus, and not just before the time of Jesus, but in this period concerning which there's relatively little information. So Protestants call this the intertestamental period, between the end of the quote-unquote Old Testament and the beginning of the quote-unquote New Testament. Now, this text describes a community of Jewish people who had beliefs and practices which were known to us modern folk, but only through the writings of the followers of Jesus. So people thought that these ideas were Christian innovations, that they were novel, they were new ideas in the first century that distinguished the Jesus teaching and the Christian movement, as it were, from Judaism. So people looked at these ideas as really the components of the new religion, Christianity. And the Dead Sea Scrolls and the community rule played a large part in this, really demolished that idea. So, for example, we don't find anywhere in the Hebrew Bible or in rabbinic literature like the Mishnah and the Talmud and a number of other rabbinic writings starting from the 2nd century of the Common Era and moving forward into the Dark Ages. We don't find certain ideas or practices such as a strong light-darkness cosmic dualism. Again, I always have to mention that is not a substance dualism. Substance dualism is the metaphysical philosophy which proposes that the universe is composed of two fundamentally different substances, one being material and the other being immaterial. That's just one type of dualism. That's substance dualism. But this is another type of dualism that's not about substance at all. It's about morality. So this is a moral dualism, and it is a truth-falsehood dualism. So it's good and bad, true and false. And so that's the dualism presented in the community rule that is not found in other Jewish writings from before the 2nd century BCE, nor is it found in the rabbinic literature, which basically ended up being what we now call Judaism. We think of rabbis and all of that, and that form of Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, developed largely in response to Christianity. And so in the 2nd century of the Common Era is when Judaism as we know it really was taking form. So this idea of this light, darkness, good, evil, truth, falsehood, dualism, especially expressed in the terms of light and darkness, and we have phrases like the children of light and the children of darkness and things like that. That was something that before 1947 was only known from early Nazarene writings, which of course people at the time referred to as early Christian writings. Well, guess what? That's in the community rule. There are other ideas, such as the Holy Spirit being the Spirit of truth, even called the Spirit of truth. Previously, that was thought to be a Christian innovation, but there it is in the community rule from the early part of the 2nd century before the Common Era, BCE. There are other things. The idea that we ought not to consider any of the material possessions that we have to be our own. Well, that's not really in the quote-unquote Hebrew Bible, nor is it in the Talmudic writings or the rabbinic writings. But there it is in the Nazarene writings, and it was thought to be a Christian innovation until 1947, the discovery of the community rule. And there it is, that same idea of none of us considering anything to be our own, to share things in the community of God's people. And, there are many other ideas and many other phrases and so on. Those are just a few examples. There's actually quite a plethora of examples which really demonstrated that there's really nothing within the writings of the early followers of Jesus which would be enough to qualify them as forming a new religion apart from Judaism. All these things which were viewed as the components, the beliefs and practices of a new religion, really were not. They were actually part of Judaism and preceded the birth of the Nazarene movement. Now, that's not to say that the Nazarenes did not have anything unique and original to say, because they certainly did. In fact, the unique and original teachings of the Nazarenes, of course, are centered around the Messiah, Jesus, known at the time as Yeshua, as the suffering servant Messiah, the crucified Messiah. Now, that is totally unknown in any Jewish writings, including the Dead Sea Scrolls from that time or before. And since it's centered in the person of Jesus, then it would be rather unexpected to find that idea present in the in any pre-Nazarene writings. Another unique idea among the Nazarenes, and this is not to say that this is all. There are certainly unique ideas. There's unique eschatology, if you want to use that term, a picture of how things will unfold in the prophetic outplaying of the culminating acts of history as we know it, that is. So those are some other unique ideas. But one other very central and significant, unique and original idea among the Nazarenes is that the Levitical priesthood was actually done. The period for the Levitical priesthood was now over. It was completed. And now there is a new priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, and that priesthood is not governed by a carnal regulation, which means basically a regulation that is based off of the flesh, and particularly what the Epistle to the Hebrews refers to when it uses that phrase is the idea that the thing which determines whether or not a person is eligible for priesthood is their lineage, being a descendant of Aaron. And there were other things, of course, but that was, a very primary aspect of qualification. There were other things that were required. Not all sons of Aaron were eligible to become priests, but that was one of the requirements that, was like kind of the first thing that you would consider. Now, this idea, the idea that there's no longer going to be an earthly temple with a Levitical priesthood. Rather, there's going to be the work in the heavenly sanctuary, and we as believers in this new system are participants in it and are actually part of the heavenly temple, and our presence here on earth extends the heavenly temple to earth. These are some of the ideas of the early Nazarene movement that were unique and original, that are not found in any previous Jewish writing. Yet, it does not constitute a new religion. It's not different enough. It's not a whole separate system. Now, it is a separate priestly system, but that, again, does not qualify as another religion, because there are precedents for that within the religion of Judaism itself, of course, because there had already been a change in the priesthood in the past. Before the Levitical priesthood was the priesthood of the firstborn. And the sacrificial system even went, according to the Jewish traditions contained in the Bible even, went back even to the gates of Eden, as it were. So, this is all to just show some of the impact that the community rule has had in our understanding of the development of the Jesus movement and what exactly it was. because everything, in order to understand what it means, it must be understood within its own context. The community rule, along with other Dead Sea Scrolls, provides us a very important part of that context in a way that we did not know before. Now that's one aspect, and that aspect alone should get all people who are interested in Jesus at all to be interested in the community rule and the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yet, this is not to say that the community rule is only important in terms of the Nazarene movement and the context of Jesus. In other words, it is not only important as background material for something else. It is important in its own right. And that is the case for multiple reasons. One of those reasons is the fact that the community rule, more than any other text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, outlines consistently and concisely the beliefs and practices of the community which it represents. It is in some ways like a constitution and bylaws of the community. In other ways, it's like a listing of fundamental beliefs, yet not precisely so, because usually a list of fundamental beliefs or a creed or anything like that has as its purpose to proclaim to others who we, as it were, are and what we are about. Now, that's not the purpose of the community rule. The community rule is more of an instructional manual within the community for who is to do what, and in giving that instruction, it says that the master of the community is to teach the members of the community how to live according to the book of the community rule, and that includes all these various things, the teaching of the two principles, truth on one hand and falsehood on the other. And it says what to do in a circumstance where someone violates the principles of the message of the community and, different things like that. So it's, in some ways, it's like a constitution and bylaws. In some ways, it's like a list of beliefs, because it does list some beliefs, but it explains it not in list form. It's more fluid. And then in other ways, it's kind of like a church manual, if you will. And those are all analogies. Those are parallels. None of them fit perfectly, but that kind of gives the idea of what this is and how important it is, because it helps us to define the community. It tells us their sense of identity. It tells us their mission. It tells us their message. It tells us their practice. So that is highly significant. It would kind of be like, let's say if time were to last, several thousand years beyond now, and the United States ceased to be a nation, and it was relatively unknown, and let's say the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution were lost, and then a few thousand years later found. And it's like, oh, okay, this is explaining what the United States of America is really all about. So it's kind of like that with the community rule. It tells us about that community. And now that community is important in many ways. They're important in their own right. In their own day, they were a very well-respected community for their righteousness, for their piousness, for their level of devotion to their beliefs. They were not viewed as just a random cult off in the wilderness, some kooky people out there. No, they were actually by outsiders. All the descriptions of them by outsiders are positive, and they were a scribal community. They were educated. They did some very important things, in terms of preserving certain writings and so on. So they weren't just, a totally off, on the edges type of group. Now, they weren't like the most popular either, but they played a significant role, and they were seated in time at a period which was so pivotal for all of the following history. Now, that does kind of get into the aspect of the community rule as background, because it's part of the context for this general period which really kind of birthed Western society as we know it, because it saw the emergence of two of the most influential religions in history, that being Judaism, particularly Rabbinic Judaism, and Christianity. But it's just another way to highlight that this is a very important text. Now, there's another way in which it is important in its own right, and that is the content of what it has to say. Regardless of one's philosophy in life, one's religion, one's current perspectives, the community rule addresses issues which are profound and far-reaching to the innermost depths of human experience. Particularly the section dealing with the two principles, truth and falsehood, which also describes this dualism in terms of morality. This section has been described by modern historians as, being written by a genius without a doubt. Why? Because it brings forward a view of the world which is so insightful and so revolutionary that anyone should be able to see the wisdom in it. So to kind of set this out, I'll briefly explain what I've explained on other calls, and that being what the community rule has to say about morality in contrast to the popular views of morality today. So there are two primary views or categories of the views concerning morality. Now, of course, morality has to do with what is good and what is bad. What's right behavior and wrong behavior. Obviously, this is important in the world. I mean, we have to have some sort of understanding of ethics, of morals. And most people have some sort of system of morals. Almost everyone does, where we consider some things to be good, some things to be bad, some things right, some things wrong. People have limits of things that they will do, things that they won't do. There are things which, if done to an individual will feel wronged or violated or hurt or whatever it may be. And there are things that can be done to an individual which will make an individual feel good and like they had something wonderful done to them. Not all experiences are equal. This is something that pretty well all humans recognize. But there's tension. How do we determine what really is right and what really is wrong? Is there such thing as really right or really wrong, or is it really boiling down to a subjective experience on the part of individuals or groups? So these are questions which underlie public discourse in relation to practically every issue, whether it's in regard to sexuality, whether it's in regard to war, whether it's in regard to economics, trade, whatever it may be. There's decisions that have to be made. Is it right to do this? Is it wrong to do this? How do we go about determining whether something is right or wrong? So this has a play in practically everything that's done in life, and this has an impact on how our lives actually are. People have this debate when it comes to government. Most advocates of democracy view communism as being an immoral system.
as being a restrictive system which deprives people of what are viewed as human rights. Whereas communists might view a democratic system as being wrong because they might view it as robbing people of other human rights. So, advocates of democracy will say, look, it's a basic human right that everyone should be able to elect their own leaders, whereas communism says, no, that's not really that important, that's not a human right. And communists will say, look, everyone has a right to free education, free healthcare, and then so on. And, people advocating democracy will typically not viewed that as important of an issue, although people, may be able to see some benefits from the other systems. But still, it comes down to values. It comes down to what's right, what's wrong. And so morality and ethics really plays a large part in all of this. It's hugely impactful. So the two basic systems of morality in the world. The first moral system that I'll mention is basically religious morality. Now, religious morality tends to view morals as grounded or decided in or by God. So really the morality is really based on divine authority. Now, one of the issues with that is that different religions have a different understanding of what their deity, what their divine authority has laid out for what is moral and what is not. So Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, pagans of all sorts differ in regard to what is really moral and what is not. And I don't mean that only in the sense of between religions. I mean that even within a religion. In fact, I cannot think of one moral issue which all Christians are entirely united on. There is difference in regard to basically everything, in regard to abortion, in regard to capital punishment, in regard to slavery, in regard to homosexuality, in regard to a whole load of things. Some people think that it's okay to lie in certain contexts. Some people think that it's not okay to lie in certain contexts. Some people think that it's okay to have multiple marital partners, and others think that it's not. These things are hugely debated. Some of them, of course, there's a majority opinion on one side or the other, but the point is that even within a religion, there's so much diversity in how morality is viewed, even though it's supposed to be based on divine authority. But people have different interpretations of what that divine authority says. But that's not even the biggest issue with that moral system. Ultimately, any system which bases its morality on divine authority boils down to being based on the principle of might makes right. God is the one who gets to decide what is right and what is wrong because he's the big guy. Now that is the principle that is at the foundation of bullying. I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I've been around longer or whatever, therefore I get to decide. The other thing that it does is that it entirely makes morality to be arbitrary. Because if it's up to God, and if God can choose whatever to be moral, on what basis does God decide? If you say that there's a basis outside of God, then morality is not based on God. And that's not the view of most Christians anyways. The typical view is that God is the one who decides what is and what is not moral. That means he could have chosen anything to be moral and anything to be immoral. And people would say, well, that is what makes it moral and immoral, because God has decided and God has said in his word, in the holy book, which I accept, that this is what is right and this is what is wrong. So, very rightly so, non-religious people, secular people, tend to reject that notion because it's might makes right. It's arbitrary. But the other view of morality, which is known as secular morality, you might also call it social morality, is insufficient as well. Secular morality essentially proposes that there is no objective moral system, which, of course, religious morality doesn't have an objective system either. It's subjective to God, which in the minds of the religious devotee makes it automatically objective for us. But that's not the case. It's just subjective to one person rather than a group of people. Now, secular morality describes how moral systems actually work in the real world pretty much accurately. And so that's an advantage to it, because it puts forward the idea that basically moral systems develop within given communities, and what morality really is an agreed-upon code of conduct within a given community or a given society. And that's basically how it actually works. You know, obviously, most Christians do not actually base, well, I say obviously, it should be obvious, but it's not obvious to most Christians. But most Christians do not actually base their morality off of the Bible. There are many things in the Bible that are disagreed with by most Christians without even realizing it. So, you know, for example, if you were to say, okay, well, morality is based off of this passage and that passage, and let's say Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, talks about slavery, and it advocates enslaving, you know, that Israelites are allowed to enslave other peoples perpetually, forever, and they can take slaves to be their property and pass them on to their children as inheritance for perpetual generations. And Exodus 21 talks about how an individual can take a slave and beat a slave, and if they kill the slave, if the slave dies within 2 or 3 days, then the slave owner, the one who killed the slave, must receive some sort of punishment. But if the slave does not die within 2 or 3 days, then the person who beat the slave is not going to be punished because the slave is their property. That's what it says in this passage in Exodus 21. Well, obviously, most Christians do not base their morality off of that. Polygamy, while it is not necessarily celebrated in most passages in the Bible, it's certainly considered a lawful, like as in it's recognized to be okay. It's not automatically rejected in the Hebrew Bible. Now that's, you know, those are things that most Christians today do not agree with. They have a different moral system. They're basing their morality off of something else. Now, this shows how secular morality accurately describes moral systems. However, I do believe that secular morality makes a huge mistake in that it says that all that morality is a social construct. And there are many problems with that, but here's the thing. Moral claims are claims. So if someone says, this is right or this is wrong behavior. Well, here's the problem. You could have one society say one thing and another society say just the opposite concerning what is right or wrong. Now, that means that both societies are making two contrary claims. The problem is that two contrary claims cannot both be true. They simply cannot both be true. Now, since that's the case, it shows that either one is right or they're both wrong, but moral claims have truth value. In other words, moral claims can either be true or false. They are not simply opinion. They make claims about the real world. So they make objective claims which can then naturally be objectively tested. So secular morality doesn't usually go there. Secular morality essentially states that it's simply a social system, but then there's the problem. How do you define what a society is or what a community is? Does your community have to have 100,000 members before it is allowed by the rest of the communities to have its own moral system? Well, if not, how many people does it have to have? Could you have 1,000 people? How about 10 people? How about 2 people? Does each individual get to decide their own moral system? And what gives one member of one moral system a right to speak against the moral system of another if there is no objective standard by which to test both? See, the thing is, the very nature of having different moral systems shows that they are not the same. Therefore, they will have discrepancies between them. So either there's going to be all-out war because people feel that they are allowed to interfere with other people's moral systems, or everyone's just going to have contrary moral systems and we'll just live in confusion and violence and whatever else is anything that's permitted in any moral system will basically happen even if others object to it. And that's basically the way the world is working right now, unfortunately. But obviously that's a problem. It's inconsistent. So secular morality, while it does describe the actual happenings of societies today and the various moral systems which they develop, it does not provide any sort of coherent understanding of what morality itself is and a means of determining what really is moral and what is not. Now, the moral system of the community rule is something which is neither divine authoritarian morality nor secular social morality. It puts forward a very different moral system. And even before we knew about the community rule, the system which it advocates is the system which we have been advocating in this message. And this moral system is a truth-based moral system. And it's actually quite simple. Basically, it just acknowledges the fact that every moral claim is in fact a claim just like any other, and therefore can be tested according to material reality, just like any claim can be. So I'll give an example that I've given many times. If I make the claim, you are hearing my voice right now, we would call that claim true. Why? Because it corresponds with material reality. In fact, what it means when we say that it is a true claim is that it matches material reality. If I said, you are not hearing me right now, we recognize that as a false claim, and what it means for it to be a false claim is that it does not match material reality. If I tell you to imagine that you're not hearing my voice right now, but you're actually hearing it, and I'm saying, just imagine this is not my voice, and now I'm going to make the claim, you are not hearing my voice right now. Well, imagining something different does not change what is false about that claim. Material reality is what counts. Imagination or metaphor or anything else isn't going to do it. Material reality is what counts. If I tell you that right now I am actually, let's just say I'm going to be silent for a moment and I'm not going to be on mute. Okay, so let's do that little experiment. Okay, so I was silent for a moment. Now, what if I tell you that I was actually speaking then, even though I wasn't on mute, and you didn't hear me? And the reason why is because I have an immaterial alter ego that was speaking in another dimension, and it's totally non-material, so you couldn't possibly hear it. Would that claim be true then if I say I was speaking? Well, I think we'd all recognize no, it wouldn't be true, because obviously if I don't have a voice box, that's basically, there's no difference between me saying, well, I have an immaterial alter ego who just spoke, and me imagining myself saying something. There's really no difference. And so the idea is that material reality is the thing that counts, and that's really it. So when it comes to moral claims, if someone makes the claim, it is okay for you to capture another person or to enslave another person and to beat them and whatever, that's a claim about material reality, and it can be tested according to material reality. So what's the premise? The reason why there's such a connection is because every action is rooted in an idea. So that idea, we can determine the idea behind the action and find out whether the idea is true or not. So slavery, let's see, is it actually true in material reality that one individual really owns another, that individual is better and all of that? No, that's not true in material reality. In material reality, both individuals came from a mother and a father and are individual beings with their own separate integrity and all of that. One was not born, with different shaped wrists to be able to have, that are made for being handcuffed or chained or anything like that. There's nothing like that at all. Plus, slavery, of course, and beating slaves and all of that is demonstrably and evidently destructive to the slave. Or that by definition is contrary to material reality. So we take the ideas that slavery is rooted upon, that the actions are rooted upon, and we see that those ideas do not match material reality, therefore the behavior is wrong. And you can do that with any moral question, period. And that is really, as we advocate and as the community rule also advocates, the basis for morality. It's based on truth. Perhaps better said, right and wrong in terms of ethics are parallel expressions to truth and falsehood. The difference is that truth and falsehood describe the degree of correlation between ideas and statements and material reality, whereas words like moral and immoral or good and bad, those ethical, moral type terms, describe the degree of correlation between behavior and material reality. But that's really the only difference. One is more focused on behavior, whereas the other is focused on ideas. But really it's the same basic principle at work. So that in itself makes the community rule very, very important, because it brings forward the only moral system which could possibly make sense. And if you really think about it, it is the only moral system which could possibly make sense, since moral claims are actually claims. There is nothing else by which you could test them other than material reality. So a truth-based morality is the only possible consistent morality. In fact, truth, material reality, is all that there is. So anything else is by definition a false system. Now, evidently the world is in great need of a true moral system, which it is unfortunately presently lacking. The community rule puts forward such a system. Not only does it put forward a coherent system for understanding what morality is and how to determine what is moral and what is not, it actually describes a means by which each individual can transform their way of thinking and their way of behaving to be entirely in harmony with material reality. In other words, to become genuine moral beings, to no longer practice immorality, to no longer carry out destructive behavior or think damaging thoughts, to live in a world where everyone governs their thoughts and behavior according to truth, according to reality, is the only world that could possibly be free of wickedness and pain and suffering. That's the only way to possibly do it. So this is not some theoretical philosophy concerning, let's just have a good scientific understanding of morality. No. This is much more than that. This has profound practical implications that are global and, dare I say, more than global in their reach. So those are some of the reasons why the community rule is very important. Of course, our investigation of community rule is itself based on truth. We want to understand, first of all, what it has to really say. We want to know what the claims of the community rule really are. We don't want to misinterpret the community rule and set up an intentional or inadvertent straw man and to judge that straw man. No, we want to understand what the community rule itself says and to judge it according to material reality. And if it lines up, then we want to carry it out in life. And if it doesn't, then we don't want to carry it out in life. But that's what we want to do. We want to study it for what it is, test it according to material reality. We want to know more about the moral system which it advocates, which, of course, we've already seen the basic moral system which it advocates. And we also want to find out if it claims to be a product of divine inspiration. These are claims that we're definitely interested in. But really we want to find out what it is interested in putting forward so that we can study its own claims. So, yeah, that's it for the initial section here of what the community rule is, why it's important, and our methods for investigating it. So, does anyone have any comments or questions broadly related to the community rule? The reason why I phrase it that way is to say that really we should have our comments and questions, in this study at least, focused on the community rule. Like, it needs to be related in some way, so we're just not going all over the place. But it doesn't have to be on a particular phrase or even just the community rule itself. It could be on the principles that we just explained, like the moral system advocated in the community rule, and what about the other moral systems and our methods of investigation in these studies. Or it could be about the history of the time period, the Qumran community, how it relates to the Nazarenes, whatever. Any of these things that are in some way related to the community rule. So, does anyone have comments or questions?
My tired brain is still having a hard time getting around I forgot what I was talking about already. The material reality, how that works. I believe it, but I just have a hard time explaining it to somebody else.
Material reality is really quite a simple idea. It's basically like this. Okay, we all are at least somewhat familiar with what the material world is. I mean, we have trees and dirt and rocks and, whatever, plastic nowadays and metal and water. There's elements all over the place. Even the air we breathe is made of different elements. And those elements are made of atoms. And then those atoms are made of various different particles. We have protons and neutrons and electrons. And then there are all these different particles out there, like neutrinos. And, there's a whole host of different particles. And it's basically just to say that that's what all things are made of. Everything that exists is made of particles, like real physical stuff all over the place. That's the idea. There's no other whatever. There's no wispy non-physical stuff. There's nothing that exists that's not made of little tiny bits of matter. That's basically what materialism is.
I understand that part, but it sounds like we're talking about a truth, and you test it by material reality. So, what does that mean, or how do you do that?
Okay, that's good. So basically, when we use the word truth, all the word truth really means is that, the truth is an idea or a statement which matches material reality. So it's like this. I take it you have your phone right there, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So if you look at your phone and you see what it's like, right? It has all these characteristics and physical properties. It has shape. It has mass. It has texture. It has density and all these different properties. So you can look at that and then close your eyes. Don't look at the phone, but imagine the phone in your mind. You can do that, right? You have the phone pictured in your mind? Okay, so here's the thing. How it is in your mind presently, that idea in itself is a conceptualization of your phone. Now, insofar as that conceptualization matches the physical reality, the actual makeup of the particles that compose your phone, to whatever degree your conceptualization matches that physical reality, we call that truth. Now, if you keep that image in your mind and you suddenly change the color of your phone just in your conceptualization, now it does not match material reality. And so we refer to that lack of coherence as falsehood. So that's false, and what that means is simply that it doesn't match material reality. So the way to test it for that particular example, and it'll be different for different examples, is to open your eyes and look at the phone. See what color it is. If you imagine it as being a red phone, but it's a blue phone, well, just look at it and see, when it's something like what color is something, that's the solution. Look and see what color it is. Obviously, if it's something else, it might be a bit more complicated of a process in order to find out. So, for example, if you want to find out, okay, let's say that there's a little bit of gold in your cell phone. And I'm pretty sure most cell phones, if not all cell phones, have a tiny bit of gold in them. And you want to know for every, basically the arrangement of atoms that make up a gold molecule, a molecule of gold, well, basically you need to, that's harder to find out. And if someone says, okay, well, there are this many atoms, and, the atoms have this many protons and neutrons and electrons, Okay, well, you're not going to be able to find that out just by looking at it with your naked eye. You'll have to get a powerful microscope and look, and there's other ways I'm sure to test it, but to actually run an experiment to in some way detect, to observe whether directly or indirectly, but in some way to actually detect how many there are. So that's a bit more complicated. If you have a question about the past, or if someone makes a claim about the past, well, the way that we can investigate that claim is, again, what we want to find out is, does the claim match material reality? So, for instance, if someone says, Jesus did not die on the cross. Jesus was not crucified, let's say. Okay, does that, what we're wanting to find out now is, well, what actually happened in material reality in the past? Because something either happened or didn't happen. He either did, in physical reality, either get nailed to a cross and die, or he didn't. Those are the only two options. So you can test that, and the way that you can test that is that today we have with us parts. In fact, I'll phrase it more accurately. Every component of present reality has been in some way formed or altered by past reality, by the various events that took place in the past. And some of those things have been altered to in such a way that we can look at it and see what happened. So just to give an example, let's say that you're driving down the road and you see a vehicle and the front end of it is totally crushed in. And it's sitting right on the road in a lane. And then you see another vehicle kind of off in the ditch, and its front end is also crushed in. Well, that's all you have. That's just present reality. You don't have the past with you at that moment when you see it, when you're driving by. You didn't see a crash happen, but you can know what happened in the past because present reality has been greatly impacted by what happened in the past. And so you can deduce from those facts of present reality that sometime in the recent past there was a car accident. So that's how history works, basically. You look at things that we have with us in the present that are capable of informing us of the past. So, for instance, like we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the community rule. And the community rule, what it is today, is a collection of manuscripts that are in basically a museum, and they're being preserved. But people have been able to determine through multiple independent methods that these scrolls did not just show up in 1947. That's not when they were written. They were written back before the time of Jesus, and they were hid in caves in the year 68 of the Common Era. And, I won't go through all the details as to how we know all those things, but it's the same thing in principle as seeing cars on the road that are smashed in adjacent to one another and knowing that, oh, yeah, that's a car crash. That's what just happened. You can figure out what happened in the past based off of present reality since it has been altered and formed by the past. So that's, we'll soon publish something on this, and that goes into details in regard to the specific question of the crucifixion as to how we can actually know, not just by reasoning it out, but we can empirically know that Jesus really did die by crucifixion during the reign of Pontius Pilate. That's a material fact, in the sense that, of course, our understanding of that is a conceptualization of what actually happened. But it's an understanding that matches what really did take place in physical reality 2,000 years ago. And so, yeah, it's by looking at things in the present and making careful observations that we can test any and all claims.
So, thoughts are about something that's real. Truth is about something that's real. That's sort of a description, that if it don't exist, the thought is, if your mind hasn't seen it, you can't hardly think of it. Anyway, I'm just wandering now. I better quit.
That's okay. But I'll say that, that's the basic idea, that our thoughts are supposed to at least correspond with the way things really are. And in fact, when our thoughts do not correspond with the way things really are to a greater degree than normal, that's when people are diagnosed with various sorts of mental illness. If you have someone who thinks that they are on a train somewhere and that train is on a giant train track that's going from planet Earth to the moon, but they're really just sitting there in a regular chair, well, people will say, well, that person is insane. That person has lost their mind. Why? Because their mental picture of what things are like does not at all match what things are really like. And so it's very important. But this is another thing that I think is important to keep in mind. We are unable to conceive of something that has absolutely no foundation in reality. In other words, we can imagine things, but all of the component parts of what we imagine are what we gained through our senses. So, for instance, someone who has been blind from birth cannot actually conceive of, they cannot conceptualize, they cannot imagine color. They cannot imagine sight. They cannot imagine what it's like to visualize. It's not like they see darkness all the time. It's not like they see blank whiteness all the time. No, there is no darkness. There is no lightness. Those ideas have no place in the thinking of someone who has been blind from birth. Why? Because they have never taken in through their senses those qualities or those characteristics, those properties of material reality, and thus they cannot form them together. Someone who can see, though, can conceptualize things according to what they have seen. And then you can alter that in your mind. But that's all you can do. You can't come up with something totally different than what can be experienced through your senses. All you can do is alter it. So you can imagine a snake that corresponds to reality, and then you could throw legs and wings and change the shape of it a bit and turn it into a fire-breathing dragon. You could do that, but all of those things, everything from wings to fire to whatever it may be, all of that is part of material reality. And even if you were to transform the wing into a totally different limb, that's not like anything we've seen, like not like an arm or a leg or a wing or anything, but some other thing that's not an arm or a leg or a wing, but still some sort of appendage. You could conceptualize that, but still it's going to be composed of elements that we are familiar with. Like it'll have texture and color and all of the different aspects that make up things that we experience through our senses. So our conceptualization is limited to things that are like what we have actually experienced through our senses. So in that sense, we exactly. We can't really conceive of something that is totally aside from truth. We can only alter or corrupt or pervert truth or, whatever. Alter, of course, is a less passioned word, I guess, but that's all we can do. We can alter our conceptualization, but we can't totally innovate to have something separate from the senses.
You can't prove it's true to anybody.
Right.
They never saw it.
Yeah, and of course, we can know that something is true without seeing it as well, just because seeing is just one of our senses. So it's not simply seeing is believing. It's having the sufficient evidence, whatever that may be. And that may be through direct sensory perception, or it might be using our senses to obtain knowledge by means of something else. Like the study of history, obviously the past is not available to us. But we can use the present to observe the past in a more indirect sense. Just like with the car crash, it's not like you'd have to see the cars actually smashing into each other to know that it happened, because you can use your senses to observe the after effects of that event and then understand from those after effects what happened. So this is why, like Jesus said, when he talked to Thomas, you believe because you have seen, but blessed are they who believe without seeing. Right? Well, what he's saying is that Thomas had enough evidence already. It's just that he wanted evidence in the way that he wanted it. He wanted proof how he wanted proof. It was the fact that he was being unreasonable in his method. He wanted it in a certain way. There's no reason for that. That's just vanity. That's just, curiosity or pride or stubbornness. Like it's like someone seeing a car crash and saying, or let's say this, they don't see the car crash, they see footage of a car crash on the news, and they meet someone who saw the car crash, and they have all this stuff, and they say, nope, I won't believe that there was a car crash until I see it with my own eyes. That would be ridiculous, because they have the evidence already, and so it's just doubt, it's just unbelief without good reason at that point. And so that was the problem with Thomas. So seeing is not always, the best way to learn something. It's not like have to see it to believe it sort of thing, or, but it's seeing as an example of sensory perception, sensory perception is the only way that we can possibly obtain information.
There's a thought been going through my mind lately, is the curse causeless shall not come. If the car is dented, it means something caused it. Right.
Okay, so I know Mary had a question too, or question or comment, whatever it was. So what was it that you had in mind, Mary?
Thank you for me.
Yeah, no problem. Toda Elohim.
Yeah, that was a good discussion. You had mentioned, maybe I misunderstood you, that the community rule talks about the Melchizedek priesthood, and I was under the impression that Melchizedek priesthood started with Christ entering the heavenly sanctuary, but was that something that they were looking forward to beforehand? Or did it start back then? And how could that happen?
So what I was mentioning is that while there are many things present in the community rule and in the teachings of the teacher of righteousness that were previously thought to be unique to the early writings of the followers of Jesus, while there are many things, there are still unique and original things that the Nazarenes had to say. And one of the examples that I gave of that is the idea that the priesthood is changed now. So that's a unique and original idea among the Nazarenes. Okay. You don't find the idea of a change in the priesthood within the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, that said, there is talk of the heavenly sanctuary. But again, it's not like, oh, the earthly system is over and the priesthood is over, and now there's a priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. That said, I will say that there is anticipation of Melchizedek doing something. There's a famous Dead Sea Scroll known as 11Q13, otherwise known as 11Q Melchizedek, and it describes Melchizedek as Elohim, gods, which is very interesting because Melchizedek is identified as plurality in 11Q13, and Melchizedek is described as, it's connected with Psalm 82 and the overthrow of the wicked gods. And so there is like an idea of Melchizedek, which of course means king or queen of righteousness. And in fact, in one Dead Sea Scroll fragment, it talks about Melchizedek and Melchiresha, which means king or queen of evil, of wickedness. And so, you have these ideas are there in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the idea of heavenly sanctuaries is there. There are certain things which in some way anticipate an antitypical system, like there's places that talk about prayers being as sacrifices. Just like you find that that sort of thing in some of the Psalms, right? Where there are behaviors like singing and praying and stuff like that, which is equated to being sacrifices. Now that is an anticipation in some ways of the antitypical system, because it's looking beyond the type to what the type represents, to what the type brings out. And so there are some things there that, in pre-Nazarene writings that do look beyond the type to the antitype. And there are things that describe the fact that there is a heavenly sanctuary. But there's nothing like what we find in the Nazarene writings in the respect of there is now a change in the priesthood wherein the Levitical priests no longer are priests. And it was predicted that the temple would be no longer, and that we will have our worship centered on the heavenly temple, and a human, namely Jesus, has ascended to heaven to become the great high priest in the heavenly sanctuary. And so that's, a totally different idea. I mean, not totally different in that it is contrary or discrepant in any way. It's just, it takes that idea way further and builds upon it in unique ways that were not present pre-Jesus.
Okay, yeah, I misunderstood you, or I didn't hear you correctly, actually. So thank you for clearing that up. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, this has been a good discussion, definitely. I'm looking at the time here, and within the next 7 minutes, really, we should wrap up. So for that reason, if anyone has a comment or question that's just so pressing on them that you really want to mention it tonight, mention it, and we'll try to deal with it quickly. If it's not so pressing, maybe write it down or whatever, or if you will remember, that's fine, and you can make the comment or ask the question in tomorrow night's meeting. And if no one has anything like that, we'll just close off. So I'll just say, does anyone have any comments or questions for tonight?
I've had one that's been kind of pressing. We don't have to answer right now, but I'll just say it. So if I forget it, somebody else can maybe bring it up. That is, what exactly is the reason for having a high priest? What is their reason for being?
Okay, excellent question. Yes, we'll address that at another time, for sure.
All right.
But, yeah, I'm glad that you asked that right now. So we have it on record, and maybe you could write it down or send it to us. But if you posted it in the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group, too, I know that if that's too complicated or anything, then don't worry about it. But it just crossed my mind that we could even start discussion on that. So anyway, if there are no other comments or questions for tonight, would anyone like to volunteer to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Thank you for your Heavenly Family, Creator gods, for doing so much for us that we are so thankful. Please help us to represent you right. Help us to get our act together so we can. Thank you for wanting us to do that. In your new name, the Branch, he and she, we ask these things. Thank you for truth. Amen.
Amen. All right. Love you all very much. Lila Tov. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.